And you're welcome to stop and interrupt me. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Divine here, and I am happy that you're all here with me today. Welcome to what's actually the last lecture with new material. So this is the last assigned set of readings for today, and we're focusing on the Central American refugee crisis, which is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because, as most of you know, I've been working in Guatemala and Honduras and other Central American countries for some time, and it is precisely Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador that form the so-called Northern Triangle that is the origin of many of the refugees who are living at our southern border. So without further ado, I'd like to just go ahead and jump into the lecture material. And I'm going to share my screen. And, let's hope this works. Okay. Let's see here. As you know, I was having some computer problems, and now it's telling me that maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Okay, and I think I'm still recording. Yes, okay, so let's hope this works. Can you see my PowerPoint, folks? It looks like you can.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. And let me see if I can do this so that you can just see me. I think it makes it a little bit more interesting than just looking at the slides. Okay, so what's this a picture of? Anybody know?
La Bestia.
La Bestia, indeed. It's the Bestia, the train through Mexico that many migrants used to take, and some still take today, through Mexico on their way to the United States. And we're focusing, yes, on the children's migration crisis. This is the broader sort of refugee crisis happening from Central America today. Maybe I need to change the title of that lecture. Okay, but before we get into the Central American refugee crisis, I want to do a little bit of review. So who experiences forced migration who is not a refugee? What other types of categories of forced mobility are there? And I'm asking you to go back to this worksheet from the last lecture. Well, here they are. I'll list them, and then this will jog your memory in terms of the definitions, okay? So internally displaced people. Who's in it? What does that mean, internally displaced people?
Someone who's internally displaced means that they are displaced from their actual home, but they still live within the borders of their own country. Like, let's say somebody was kicked out of their home by like ISIS, or they're escaping ISIS, but then they get stuck into a refugee camp that's still within their country. That's an internally displaced person.
Right, right. And how many internally displaced people are there? From your worksheet, does anybody have that handy? The UN, the 2015 report estimates that there are 14.7 million IDPs in the world. I'm gonna try this, folks, and you tell me if you think this helps, all right, with the feedback. So I'm gonna go to chat here. Is everything working okay with the audio? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you great.
Okay, all right. And hopefully with the recording of this lecture, everything's gonna go okay. All right. All right, what about development displacees? Give me an example of a development displacee. I want you to think of hydroelectric dams, maybe in China or in Guatemala.
You said when development forces them out, so they build in their homes, and so they have to move somewhere else.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay, that's exactly right. I want to ask just one more technology question here. If I'm recording this lecture for the other students and I want your responses to be recorded, I probably can't use my headphones. Is that right? What do you think?
I believe it records everything from the Zoom.
Okay, so we'll record everything from the Zoom. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, folks, this computer I'm working on, it had problems. I had to get a new OS, so that's part of the technology issue I'm having. But okay, thank you for clarifying. So that's exactly right. We were talking about sort of hydroelectric dams. These are people who are displaced in the name of industrialization, modernization, large-scale urbanization projects. This could even include indigenous communities that are displaced for fracking, oil production, any number of extractive industries.
I was about to say, like with like Brazil and the indigenous people that are living there in the rainforest, and how they are wanting to clear cut their home area where they've been living for like generations.
Right, that's another example. Very good, very recent one. What about environmental, and how many development displacees? 15 million, okay. How many folks live in Texas? Does anybody know the population of Texas?
I think it's like 25 million.
I think it's closer to 30, like 30, 31, but you're right in there. So when you're thinking about these numbers, I always think it's useful to sort of have a point of reference that, you know, we're talking about the scale of nearly the entire state of Texas when we're talking about these flows of people. Okay, environmental disaster displacees. Give me an example. What is an environmental or disaster displacee if you got this term on the exam?
Earthquake.
Sea level rises.
Yes, people are displaced by earthquakes. What was the other example?
I would say Chernobyl as well. Like
Chernobyl, yes, most certainly. And what's the other sort of big category that we want to be sure to capture here?
Blood?
Climate
People
change.
displaced by climate change. Yeah.
Exactly, climate change refugees, okay? This is going to be the frontier of forced migration in the future, and us geographers are going to play a big role in thinking about how we mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so it's interesting, you know, Katrina would be an example. Sorry, folks, here we go. Katrina would be an example. Certainly, but you also want to think about rising sea levels in places like Bangladesh and in India. And in particular, those developing countries are not in a position like the Netherlands to respond to the challenges of climate change. So we have sort of the environment exacerbating already existing global inequalities. Trafficking victims. Give me an example of what is a trafficked individual?
someone who is moved from their home to another place and sold off to other people.
Right, trafficked people are being basically exploited or extorted for money and being held against their will. This often includes types of mobility, but people can also be trafficked in place, and that happens quite a bit in the United States, right? Where someone might be or trafficked within their same country, not necessarily moving across international lines, but there is unfortunately a robust illicit trafficking ring that is global. And so when we think of trafficking and sort of forced labor and exploited labor, we do think of people who are trafficked into sex work, and that is 58%. The UN estimates that 58% of the 21 million people who are trafficked each year, that they're working in sex work, but there's another 36% of forced laborers who are not working in sex work, but are still working in situations where they cannot leave, okay? We talked about stateless people. Those are people that for reasons oftentimes of war or immigration policies that don't offer birthright immigration citizenship, that people can be left without a state, without a nationality at all. And because the global political system still privileges the nation state as the most powerful political entity, that becomes a problem, right? Because the UN and the Human Rights Commission can only back up the human rights of individuals in as much as nation states are willing to respect them. So any questions in terms of these types of forced migration?
As far as stateless people, can we have some examples of that?
Sure. So a stateless person would be an example of maybe someone living in the Balkans in 1990s after the breakup of the USSR. There were the Balkan Wars, and basically Yugoslavia broke up. And if people were on the wrong side of the line, or they were not ethnic Serbs living in Serbia's, maybe ethnic minorities living in Serbia, they wouldn't necessarily, because of wartime or because of xenophobic policies, would not be granted citizenship in the territory they were born. This also happens in Thailand. That's another example that I know, where ethnic minorities or people who are born to foreigners, non-nationals, will not automatically be granted citizenship. And so people can end up being stateless. And there are 10 million estimated stateless people in the world. And so what we have when we add up all of these categories, and this is getting at your quiz question number 1 for today, while the UN recognizes 21 million refugees, those are people who are crossing international boundaries to avail themselves to a foreign government because their nation state is unable to protect them, and they're being persecuted because of their religion, their ethnicity, or they're belonging to a special group. 21 million people meet that narrow refugee. Climate change refugees don't meet that definition. And so therefore, they are not able to legally apply for asylum in many countries and receive it. Okay, so 65.3 million people who are forcibly displaced every year, and 21 million of those are refugees. Good question. Any more questions?
Yes. Is the 14.7 IDPs also included in that 65.3 million?
Yes. So the total of all of these categories, if you have your worksheet, recognized refugees, 21.3 million. Skip survival migrants for now. IDPs, 14.7. Development displacees, 15 million. Environmental refugees, 22.5 million. That number is going to go way up. Trafficked individuals, 21 million. Stateless peoples, 10 million. And then I have a category of narco refugees, and that's helping us segue into today's lecture. And I'm just desperate to work with students and do this work on my own to really think about drug trafficking organizations as a driver of forced mobility in Central America. This is part of the problem with the problem of the refugee regime, that back in the 1940s and the early 1950s, 1951, when the convention was written and the definition of refugee was written, there were not powerful criminal organizations like we have today. That it would include, yes, the Sinaloa cartel, but also ISIL in the Middle East, right? Nation states didn't have competing powers that are vying for territorial and political control. So yes, the whole point here is not to sort of worry about the math, but if you were to roughly add up refugees, IDPs, development displacees, environmental refugees, traffic individuals, stateless people. I think that's where that 65.3 million number comes from. Okay. Now, there's a video that I think is really important that you watch. And I'm going to ask you to do that on your own time, because it's not super critical for what we're doing moving forward and really exploring this category of narco refugees. But I want you to watch this video. It's 12 minutes long. The link is here. It's also on the track site. And it's about the kafala system in the Middle East and the building of the World Cup in 2022. How many of you, let me pose this question another way. Have any of you heard about some of the human rights concerns around these labor conditions in the Middle East and in Qatar particularly?
Yeah, I've heard that like they have like living conditions for these like imported workers is one of the terms I heard used. Is they like have very poor, like one bathroom to like 20 to 30 people living in a single room, forced to sleep like right next to each other, and being paid like little to nothing for what they're forced to endure.
Yes, most certainly. Anybody else have some more details to offer on the kafala system in particular, in addition to the working conditions of these immigrants?
Isn't there something about just the lack of infrastructure and being so high up that a lot of people fall? Is that?
Yeah, indeed. That's part of it. Do you all mind if we just watch it quickly together? I think it would be worth it. It's not that long. And I think that it will be useful. Now is the time, I think. Okay. So let's see. I'm going to also have the chat up to make sure that the technology is working. So I think I stopped that. Let me try this out. And jump on chat and let me know if this is working or not working, if you don't mind.
It's working.
It's working?
Mm-hmm. Audio, I think, is off though. Yeah. I can't hear what the video is saying. That's the only thing.
Let's see here.
Government have said they're going to do something about it. So now, with the stadium for the 2022 World Cup starting to rise out of the ground, we've returned to Doha to find out if anything has changed. The place to start is with the World Cup preparations. Here at the Aspire Academy, a state-of-the-art sports centre, Qatar's young football stars are being coached to compete against the world's best in 2022 on a full-sized, air-conditioned pitch.
On a blazer showed Qatar name. Everyone is only wanting to celebrate. Qatar won.
Everything I do, I eat, I sleep, everything is for football because it's like my life.
The other controversy that there's been about the building of the World Cup and the use of migrant labour. Do you have any thoughts on that, or you don't want to talk about it? No. But he might want to talk about it. We're talking about the academy. Okay. They are right to be sensitive. This is the Al Bida Tower, the HQ of Qatar's football authorities. On the 38th and 39th floors are offices occupied by the 2022 World Cup Organising Committee. But some of the men who built these offices have become victims of serious labour exploitation. They went unpaid for over a year. They were abandoned by their employer and left to live in squalor. Qatar's labour system stopped them quitting their jobs or leaving the country without their employer's permission. The Qatari authorities were told about their plight months ago, but we tracked some of them down who are still trapped in Doha. While the World Cup Organising Committee enjoys the lavish offices they built, these workers are still waiting to be paid.
दुःख लाग्ने कुरो भने आफूले गरेको एउटा परिश्रम नपाउँदाखेरि र कसैले नपाउँदाखेरि र एउटा त्यो आफूले गरेको परिश्रमको लागि अन्त दौडधुप गर्नको लागि
Project paperwork shows the offices were commissioned by a Qatar government organisation under the auspices of the current emir. He is also the president of the World Cup Organising Committee. The budget was £2.5 million, but the contractor, Lee Trading and Contracting, stopped paying wages in 2012.
पैसा छैन त्यसकारण नभएको नि पैसा भए त को बस्यो यहाँ एक सालको स्यालेरी मिलेको छैन अब कसरी घर जाने टिकट काट्ने पैसा पनि छैन अब टिकट मात्र लिएर जानु पनि भएन रे त्यहाँ 4 साल भइसक्यो घरबाट आएको टिकट मात्र लिएर जानु
There's a huge contrast between that place and the Al Bida Tower, where the problems began for those men. Huge luxury at the Al Bida Tower and real difficulty where they're living now, and they just don't understand why the Qatari government can't help them get out of that situation, and the Qatari courts can't either. And it's a good question because I can't quite understand either. The World Cup Tower workers are not an isolated case. Low pay and even no pay is commonplace in Qatar's construction industry. Just a few miles from Doha's luxury hotels, we found over 60 workers employed by Ibex Technical Trading and Contracting, marooned in a desert camp. Some of them said they have not been paid for 5 months.
प्रब्लम त यहाँ धेरै छ सर है अब तपाईको पानीकै विषयमा हेरौँ अब नुहाउने यताउता युज गर्ने पानी नै हाम्रो नुनिलो पुरै नुन भएकै पानी छ है खाने पानी पनि अब त्यति राम्रो पानी दिइराखेको छैन अलिकति विश्वास पनि नगर्ने ठाउँ भइसक्यो अब 4-4 महिना 5-5 महिनासम्म त स्यालेरी एउटा त कस्तो नदेला भन्ने उनीहरुको भनाइ आइराखेको हुन्छ यहाँ बच्चाले त बाबा घर कहिले आउने त्यही त अरु के बोल्न जान्छ र है
The guys here, there's 65 of them from India, Sri Lanka, Nepal. They're getting into big debt and they're living in really, really appalling conditions. No showers, salty water, and it's making them sick. And it's really shocking to see. It really is.
फोन आयो भने यसरी कम्पनी सेलर रोकिरहेछ अब त्यसरी टाइम दिइरहेछ टाइम दिँदा दिँदै त्यस्तो कम्पनीमा किन गएको के कस्तो तरिकाले त्यो कम्पनीमा गएको यदि यदिसम्म कम्पनी सेलर नदिने कम्पनी कस्तो हुन्छ हामी यहाँ मर्यो भने मरे हुने तबरु कसको लागि गएको भन्ने किसिमको प्रतिक्रिया आछ
Ujwal Bishwakarma's wife Kamla and their son Ashish live in a rented room on the outskirts of Nepal's capital, Kathmandu.
घरमा फोन गर्दाखेरि म पैसा पठाएको छैन छोराले अब यत्रो ऋण गरेर मैले पठाएको एक पैसा घरमा पठाएको छैन भनेर देउरहरु पनि त्यसै भन्नुहुन्छ ससुरा पनि त्यसै भन्नुहुन्छ अरु कुरा थाहा छैन घर जग्गा जान लाग्यो अब अंश संश पछि पाउने नपाउने अब छोरालाई कुरा गर्ने भनेर घरबाट कराउनुहुन्छ मलाई। अब मैले भन्न सक्ने के हो र, म यस्तो बेहालमा बसिरहेको छु।
Many of the migrant workers' problems begin in their own countries, with recruitment agents who charge huge fees in exchange for false promises about jobs and salaries in Qatar. The recruitment agent which sent many of the men to Ibex Trading is Capital International Manpower. We sent 2 men to visit the agency with a hidden camera, posing as prospective migrants. Although the Ibex workers had not been paid for months, staff assured them that they would face no problems with their salaries in Qatar.
बिल्डिङ कन्स्ट्रक्सनमा भनेको कामको स्यालेरी पाउँछ, अरू भित्र इन्डोर काम भन्ने फरक पर्न सक्छ हैन। कन्स्ट्रक्सनमा भनेको त्यस्तो हो। तलब नपाएर कोही पनि फर्केको छैन हैन। राम्रो कारणले कोही त काम गर्न सक्ने, या मेडिकल गरे पनि उहाँ गएर गर्दा पनि अनफिटनेस हुने, त्यो भनेको हुन्छ। अब काम भनेको तलब नपाएर चाहिँ अझै कसरी गर्न आएको छैन। हजुर
Many migrants fall victim to the so-called double contract. This happened to Shambu Shrestha, another Ibex employee sent to Qatar by Capital International Manpower.
Contract को बारेमा वहाँबाट 2500 भनेर पठाएको, यहाँ 900 दिइरहेको छ। सो वहाँबाट फर्मेन भनेर पठाएको, यहाँ लेबरमा काम गरिराखेको छ। पछितो त भइराखेको छ। यति कमाई नेपालमा कमाउन सकिन्थ्यो, यहाँ आएर केही अलि बढ्ता कमाउने हिसाबले आएको, तर अहिलेसम्म स्यालेरी पाइएको छैन, कमाउन सकेको छैन। अब यो देशमा नआउने अब।
Others suffer a far worse fate. According to Qatar's own figures, 882 migrants from India and Nepal died in 2012 and 2013. But most of these deaths were classified as sudden death, cause unknown, sometimes known as sudden death syndrome. One recent victim was Rishi Kandel, who died in May 2014.
वहाँ ड्युटीबाट आउनुभयो, ड्युटीबाट आएपछि खाना खाएर सुत्नुभयो। सुतेपछि बिहान हाम्रो टाइम हुन्छ 4:45 मा ड्युटी जाने। त्यतिबेला रामले ऋषि दाइलाई बुझायो, दाइ ड्युटी जाने बेला भयो, तर दाइ बुझेन, झसाङ्गे भयो, डरायो। कसरी भयो यसरी?
The room where Kandel used to sleep is now used as a store. No one dares sleep there anymore.
मान्छे मरेपछि डराउँछ, अब फेरि अर्को मर्छ कि भनेर डराएको, अरु के मनमा चिसो पसेको।
19 days after Rishi Kandel died in Qatar, his body was flown home to Kathmandu, where it was received by his wife, Saraswati.
हुन त किन नहुने, अब एउटा केही गरमला भनेर अब त्यस्तो त्यति सपना बोकेर गएको मान्छे एकैचोटि त्यस्तो भयो भनेको सुन्दाखेरि त जसलाई पनि नि हुन्छ। त्यस्तो होला भने सोचेर त पठाएको त कसैले पनि हुँदैन। आफू पनि अब एक्लो छु हैन, यता आफू पनि बाँच्ने हुनै पर्यो। त्यस्तो देख्न पर्दाखेरि र त्यो सुन्न पर्दाखेरि जुन आफूमाथि बित्यो त्यो कुनै पनि श्रीमतीमाथि अथवा कुनै पनि दिदीबहिनी आमामाथि नबितोस् नै भन्न चाहन्छु मैले। म मात्रै नभएर अरू पनि कति छन् त्यस्तो हैन, सबैको नै त्यो गरिदियोस् नै भन्ने मलाई लाग्छ।
People from the poorest countries of the world are still being bitterly exploited here in Qatar's building boom. Now, as the construction of the stadia starts for the 2022 World Cup, The question is whether the people's game, football, that so many people love, can make a difference. Here at the Al Wakra Stadium, Qatar's first World Cup venue, construction is underway. The World Cup offers Qatar a unique opportunity to reform its labour system. There are signs the authorities are starting to recognise the scale of the problems their workers face. But will they grasp this chance? Will they turn words into action? Or will Qatar continue to allow its migrant workers to be treated as just another disposable commodity?
Okay. Uh-oh. All right, folks. So that video painted the grim reality of the 2.6 million foreigners who live in Qatar. There's only some like 300,000 Qatari citizens, and because of oil reserves, those people receive per capita payments in oil revenues and live very lavish, some of the richest lives around the world. And there's this huge underground segregated workforce. And what you didn't see so clearly in that video is this idea of the kafala system. And if you were to do some more research and we had more time to talk about it, you'll see that oftentimes when these immigrants who are coming from India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, when they get to Qatar, that their employers will take their passports. So they're not only being kept there in terms of their wages being withheld, wage theft, but oftentimes their mobility is, they're rendered immobile because their passports are being taken. And so this last week, when we're sort of coming back to the global refugee regime, is also about the politics of mobility and the idea that, you know, given the fact that there are, you know, nearly 70 million people who are forcibly displaced, and thinking about the inequality of movement, that, you know, many geographers like myself argue that you can understand the world in terms of its policies and its power relations and practices of uneven development through the lens of mobility, through migration. Who gets to move? How is that determined? And how does that reflect how globalization works? And also a key source of injustice in this interconnected world. And does anybody have any comments or questions on the kafala system, or want to just comment on those labor conditions or anything that they know that might add to the discussion?
Do the workers that are going to work in Qatar not know about the kafala system, and that their passports might get taken from them?
Yeah, I certainly think that there's misinformation, and that is one of the dishonest ways in which their labor becomes conscripted, essentially. Yeah. Someone has a lovely bird outside. That's nice.
I think it's I actually have no idea, but there it is.
So there's, you know, interesting for those of you who might be thinking about research projects in the future. It's fascinating to think about the World Cup as sort of an articulation of globalization, an example of globalization, and also a way to think about global inequality and, you know, what we call the politics of mobility. So this comes back to a really an important concept that we're working with this week, which is this idea of a survival migrant. Who is a survival migrant? Well, it's people who are outside of their country of origin as a result of their country's inability to ensure their most fundamental human rights. When I ask you to define survival migrant, that it is people who are forcibly leaving their home countries because their basic fundamental human rights cannot be met in their home country. And that includes, yes, liberty and basic security as guaranteed by the 51 Refugee Convention, but also really important, the right to subsist, the right to clean drinking water, the right to a secure food source. So survival migrant is a proposed alternative to the category of refugee, or it forces us and enables us to think about forced mobility in ways that the refugee definition doesn't allow us to do. And folks, here's this idea of a narco refugee, okay? I don't think anybody has published on this, but I would argue and intend to argue, and if you're interested in working on this with me, please let me know, to make the case legally in terms of refugee law to demonstrate that drug trafficking organizations are a key driver of forced migration outside of Central America today. So let's think about that category. You're not going to have a number for the number of narco refugees. I just have it here on this list to sort of get you thinking about the diversity of drivers of forced migration. All right, so the title slide mistakenly said the children's refugee crisis. Today we are calling it the Central American refugee crisis, because I think when I taught this class, this lecture for the first time a couple years ago in 2014, it was children that were coming to the border, and they were called UACs, unaccompanied children, right? And so you had an uptick from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in the number of unaccompanied children who are coming to the US border. Do y'all remember that when it was a big topic in the news? We talked about this a little bit before, but
Yes.
yeah, lots of kids were coming. And that gets us to the story of Cecilia, who you read about in the New York Times article titled "The Smuggled Girl's Odyssey of False Promises and Fears." And what I want you to be thinking about with this article is how the experience of Cecilia in her journey to the United States, how her journey illustrates the concept of survival migrant, right? Because she wouldn't be qualified as a refugee, given the strict nature of that definition. She's not being persecuted based by the nation state, but certainly she's being forced to move and to leave because her life and the livelihood of her family, they can't meet their basic human rights living in the highlands of Guatemala and the conditions they find themselves. Okay, so she exemplifies that category of survival migrant. And then I also want you to think about how Cecilia's own story exemplifies or challenges the binary between refugee and economic migrant, okay? Is there anybody out there who is willing to talk to me a little bit about the critique of the refugee system in the sense that it creates this binary between refugees and economic migrants? What do I mean by that?
I would think that with refugees, it's kind of you're being forced and well, you're just being forced, like you can't do anything to control it. And if you're an economic migrant, you're consciously making that choice in order to pursue a better life. But that binary is just not inclusive of everything that can go into somebody maybe having to be what is considered an economic migrant, but really it's kind of just a force of coercion that makes somebody want to leave their country.
Right. And yeah, anybody else want to add? That was great. Thank you. Anybody else? I think that, yeah, that was a really good explanation. This idea that the category of refugee is, when you have a binary of refugee versus migrant, it maps onto another binary of forcibly displaced, people who are forced to move, and people who choose to move. So if you're not labeled a refugee and you're labeled a migrant, it gives the misconception to taxpayers and US voters, for example, that people like Cecilia are coming to the United States because they choose to, right? And it puts all of those survival migrants, Cecilia is a survival migrant, into the category of migrant, and it sort of is synonymous with economic migrant in the United States, right? Tell me a little bit about Cecilia's life. Did anybody have, I hope you've done the reading. If you haven't, please do so. In what ways does she exemplify forced mobility? And sort of what is her story? How does she end up going to the United States? It's interesting too that, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I'll take a crack at it since no one else is. She I guess her father had fled to the U.S. years before and caused debt in her family to a coyote.
Yeah.
And they were living, or she was living, I want to say, with her mother and aunt maybe in like a tiny room or like a tiny house that was just not fit for the 10 some odd people that were living there, and her life just wasn't very good. Say the least.
Yep, it's interesting how it sort of illustrates the cycle of debt that circulates around the smuggling market. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier in the semester is that the war on drugs and the implementation of the war on drugs in Latin America has created the drug wars and has created a lot of the violence and the splintering of the cartels. And rather than eradicating the power of the cartels have become much more wealthy, much more powerful, and they have diversified into human smuggling. Now cartels are making money through smuggling. And when they're not directly involved in smuggling, oftentimes cartels, because they will tax any illegal activity coming through their territories, they'll make coyotes pay $1,000 per head, or sometimes even turn over a young woman to sell her into prostitution, and then she's becoming trafficked. So you have to understand that the cost of the smuggling is directly related to the fact that the cartels are now involved in the human smuggling business, but also going back to our segments on immigration and about how since the border has begun to be fortified, the desert in Arizona became the remaining channel for people. And so that makes the trip that much more difficult, that much more expensive. And these coyotes are really smart. They go to these Mayan villages and they'll often say, hey, I'll charge you $13,000 to smuggle you into the United States. And the people say, well, I don't have $13,000. And they say, well, your aunt has a title on this property, doesn't she? Right? Just put the title for the property up for collateral. And then when basically, people don't make it, or if they don't pay, the coyotes often use violence and other tactics to make sure that people pay up. What happens to Cecilia when she gets to the United States? Actually, to Brooks County.
She gets held in a stash house, and then she's held there for like a really long time, and the coyotes are trying to get more money from her family, but they've literally given everything they had. They put up the deed for their house, and there was also the loan of $7,000 as well. So they literally had absolutely nothing for her. And so even though it was a gesture of good faith for her family to send her over, they ended up being screwed out of it completely.
Right. And basically they end up trying to extort more money from her family, as you were saying. And at that point, she's crossed the line from being smuggled into trafficked, right? She's being held against her will and being extorted for money, either through bribes or through outright ransom payments or through labor, like the example we saw with the kafala system in Qatar. So what we're getting at here is that the line between smuggling and trafficking, the binary between smuggling and trafficking, which also reproduces this force, a person chooses to migrate versus is forced to, right? Where if you're paying a coyote, somehow it's your decision of free will, but then when you're being trafficked, it's against your will. What we see is that it is not a binary. It is not that people either freely choose to be smuggled or against their will become trafficked. It overlaps. And we saw that too with the refugees from Syria, right? How their experience where they give all the money that they can to get out of Syria to smugglers, and then they end up being sold off to other smugglers, extorted, being held against their will. And at that point, again, the smuggling, trafficking overlap becomes really clear. And I just want to take you back for a moment to the readings that we did on Guatemala. You know about the Scorched Earth campaign in Guatemala, right? What was the Scorched Earth campaign in Guatemala in the 1980s? Who remembers?
It was the U.S.-backed overthrow of President Arbenz, and I guess the killing of 200,000 Guatemalan citizens.
Yes, well, it's interesting you mentioned. So the CIA-backed overthrow, it happens in 1954. And Scorched Earth campaign is in the early 1980s. And the Scorched Earth campaign is when that 36-year genocidal civil war turns genocidal. That's when Rios Montt, who was the general president of Guatemala at the time, he began to implement genocidal policies against the Maya people. And so Scorched Earth campaign refers specifically to that genocidal campaign in the early 1980s that produced the deaths of, up to 200,000 people. So that's a specific moment in time in this history. And what's not made clear in this article is that Nebar, where Cecilia is from, this is actually one of the territories in Guatemala that was hit the hardest by the genocidal campaign of Scorched Earth. So like there's this whole history of not only 500 years of Maya land dispossession and immiserization, but like the Scorched Earth campaign of the 1980s is critical to understand the conditions of poverty that this community found itself living in, right? So did she choose to leave Nebar to, try to go and work? No, of course, that's her ancestral home. That's where she would want to stay. Again, the binary between who chooses and who is forced often doesn't hold in practice. And that's why it's so critical that we have to be campaigning for rethinking this category of forced mobility, right? And we got to be darn clear that when we're talking about 16-year-old girls like Cecilia leaving from the Mayan highlands, that these are not people who are choosing to come to the United States and break the law, and they deserve what they get. These are people who are being forced to move and often experiencing immense violence and coming and fleeing from situations of immense violence. So let's go back to nice segue to the 54 overthrow of Arbenz. So you read the article that says that the United States has played a big role in sparking the refugee crisis that's unfolding at the border, right? So what were some of the factors that were mentioned in the article? But the first one they mention is the one that you see here, the 1954 overthrow of Arbenz. How did the overthrow of Arbenz in 54 contribute to the refugee crisis at the US border today?
The reason that the United States overthrew Arbenz is because they thought that he was a communist, or that was their at least reasoning, because he was actually like providing a social safety net for the Guatemalan citizens. So when they did overthrow him, they basically took over. The United States basically took over the Guatemalan government and put in their own proxy, and so that way they could actually like have control over Guatemala.
Right, and who knows what Guatemala would have been like today had Arbenz not be thrown out, if he had successfully implemented agrarian reform and basically created a new deal in Guatemala. What was happening in Costa Rica in the 1950s?
Same thing.
Same thing, no military overthrow there. And where is Costa Rica today? In a much better position than Guatemala. I'm not saying it's the only factor, but I am going to argue that if you want to understand why Guatemala is in the infamous Northern Triangle today, you have to at least acknowledge 54 overthrow Arbenz and what could have been. The article ends, it set a pattern. You look at decades following the military strongmen, the juntas, the mass killings, it's no wonder Guatemala is in such terrible shape today. Had there not been a 54 overthrow of Arbenz, there would not have been a 36-year civil war, and Guatemala might look a lot more like Costa Rica than Honduras, had that been the case. And then, of course, as you know, the United States fueled these civil wars. And by fueling, I'm literally talking about providing the money to buy the fuel, literally, and also figuratively, hundreds of millions of dollars. I actually think it tips $1 billion was given by the United States to Guatemalan and Honduran militaries interfering in political processes in the region. What are some of the other dynamics that the article mentions? Or off the top of your head, what are some of the other ways or other US policies that have contributed to this crisis?
The drug war.
The drug war, yeah. The
Biden.
implementation of the war on drugs, most definitely. And before we get there, the article says that another sort of contributing factor to the negative situation was that while the US was supporting the Salvadoran dictatorships as well as the Guatemalan dictatorships and engaging in subversive sort of engagement in Nicaragua and other places, that the refugees who came to the United States were denied refugee status, right? And if you're not a refugee, what are you? Well, if you're here legally, you're an economic migrant, but if you're not, you're just an illegal. And all of the negative discursive links that come with that. You're even subhuman, right? The alien is the term. And gosh, you know, those victims of that violence, what a slap in the face, right? To not even receive refugee status. And then, as I think it was Mitchell was chiming in, sorry if it was somebody else, the US launches the drug wars as cities are hollowed out. And remember, the drug wars were fought both in the United States and in Latin America. So the drug war and mass incarceration leads to a rise of gang violence across the United States, but this also impacts Central American youth in particular. For those of you who remember or who have read, what particular gang am I thinking about that had its origin story in the United States that was talked about in the reading?
You're thinking about MS-13?
About MS-13, right. So how does MS-13 get its start in the jails of California in the 1990s? It's not covered so much in detail in this article. Does anybody know? With all of this crazy COVID business, I can't remember what I've said here versus elsewhere. But essentially, many of those Salvadoran youth who were denied refugee status and labeled that horrible term illegals, rather than receiving refugee services and an opportunity to integrate into society, they were undocumented and having to live in the crappiest of neighborhoods, often that were gang infested, that had high poverty rates. Rather than being able to get legal employment, they had to work under the counter. And many of these youth, after surviving violence and coming to the United States, found themselves threatened by gangs in Los Angeles. And many of the Salvadoran youth settled in the Pico Union neighborhood, some of the worst neighborhoods in LA, and they formed MS-13 as a survival strategy and a sort of brotherhood to provide the community and safety net that the refugee services should have provided. And these young men, during the war on crime and the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s, there was mass incarceration, gang abatement, and these young men were incarcerated, and MS-13 morphs into a youth organization, to a transnational gang. And then especially following the 1996 policy of expedited removal and the Illegal Immigrant Reform Act, many of those gang members were deported back to Central America, even though they hadn't been there in many, many years, and they were sent back without any records. So police forces in that region didn't know what type of people they were receiving. And then, of course, the war on drugs is also implemented in Latin America. And do you remember by chance which president in Mexico starts implementing US-style war on drugs policies? Does anybody remember this? There were two pan presidents. One was Fox and the other one is who?
You say the one that declared the war on drugs?
Yeah, do you remember his name by chance?
Felipe Calderon.
Yeah, Felipe Calderon, exactly. Remember that Mexico had been governed by the PRI party that had been in power since the Mexican Revolution of 1920, right? There was the Revolution for Independence in 1810, 1820, and then there was the Mexican Revolution 1910, 1920. And that's when sort of the old school post-colonial elites were overthrown, and Lázaro Cárdenas comes into power and he nationalizes oil, and the PRI party does evolve to be a one-party state, and by the time that 2000 rolls around, it's basically like a soft dictatorship. And in 2000, the PRI party is voted out, the PAN party is voted in, and the PAN party decides to implement the war on drugs rather than just sort of engaging in bribery and small-scale corruption to allow drugs to flow without interference from the government. And so Mexico starts getting a lot of aid from the United States to implement the war on drugs, but this backfires, right? From 2000 to 2006, there's an uptick in violence. The cartels start splintering. You have the Hydra effect, if you remember that. And then in 2006, Calderon gets elected and he doubles down. He declares war on the narcos, and the narcos are like, bring it, right? There's estimated 250, 300,000 civilians in Mexico alone that have been killed, caught in the crossfires. And of course, these criminal organizations are extorting people in Mexico. If we had time and we were in class, I bet we could have somebody share a story. Many people, even in our own university, have family members who have been threatened by gangs and cartels. This is contributing to the flow of people to this country. Now, this dynamic we've had a little bit less time to talk about. In 2009, there's a coup in Honduras. Does anybody know about this coup? Who could tell us a little bit about it? Who was Manuel Zelaya, for example? Well, in 2009, the Honduran military, with the backing of the Supreme Court, illegally ousted an elected government, the president of Manuel Zelaya. He was kind of a populist reformer, and the sort of entrenched oligarchy, the traditional powers in Honduras, were not happy with many of the reforms that he was suggesting. He was sort of a progressive person, suggesting higher taxes, more distribution of wealth, more social safety nets. He proposed a reform of the Constitution. The military oligarchy complex said that he was going to change the Constitution to remain president for life, and they used that as a pretext to, you know, arrest him and make him leave the country. So there was a military coup in Honduras, and the United States backed the coup regime. There was no diplomatic sanctions. There should have been economic sanctions. There should have been diplomatic sanctions against Honduras. But the reality, folks, is that the sort of colonial military elite in Honduras has had a very tight relationship with the US government. And so perhaps the United States side in its favor to allow that coup to happen so that those US friendly classes would remain in power. All right. So any questions on all of those dynamics? We've got about 12 minutes left, and I've got some things that I want to share with you. And I'm hoping to inspire maybe a couple of you to think about honors projects or even master's theses that need to be written on this topic, because there is truly a refugee crisis unfolding at the border. And I had a chance to go there last November, and I'm going to be going again in the fall with the class to look at these refugee camps that are forming along the US border. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Have you heard about these refugee camps at the US border?
Yes, in Matamoros.
In Matamoros, and also other border cities like Laredo, Tijuana, so, you know, in major sort of Mexican cities where we have major flows of people coming and going from the US to Mexico daily, that we have the formation of refugee camps. And these refugee camps are not filled with children, but now families, okay? So before we get to this language of crisis, and I'm going to argue that indeed it is a crisis, but it's a humanitarian crisis, not a crisis of the United States being invaded by tons of people. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that this horrible situation in Central America, of which the United States has played a large role, is producing refugee flows. And these flows are not necessarily high when we look at sort of the historical context. So here, I showed this to you before, but it's worth repeating at this moment. The reality is that illegal border crossings have been declining since the 2008 recession, okay? And probably the COVID situation is going to complicate things even further. But we know that that the statistics illustrate that compared to the presidency of George W. Bush or Clinton or even George W., George Bush and George W. Bush, that there was a much higher flow of undocumented people coming from Central America and Mexico. So we're now in a moment of sort of historical lows since the 1990s in terms of the number of people who are coming. Okay, so despite this language of a caravan, despite the language of an invasion, it's just not, if you look at the border, the US Customs and Border Patrol's own data, we are not looking at historically high flows, quite the contrary. What we do see is that we're having an uptick of people, of families who are coming together. So during the debt crisis in Mexico in the 1980s, there were many people, survival migrants, who were coming to the US fleeing economic hardship in Mexico because of the debt crisis, structural adjustment policies. And that changed with the war on drugs, with the dynamics unfolding in Central America, and we started seeing an uptick of children, and now we see families. I think that this trend reflects a transition from migrants who are coming and fleeing economic poverty to people who are refugees fleeing conditions of unlivability because of violence, not just poverty, but poverty and violence. Okay, so that's what the data is telling us. And so we have seen an uptick in people who are coming with family. Okay, and you can see that in this graph here from 2016. Since 2018, an uptick in people traveling with family. And this gets us to some of the current dynamics unfolding with the infamous family separation and detention. In 2018, April, General Jeff Sessions announced a zero tolerance policy to be implemented by DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, where all migrants who entering into the United States without authorization will be authorized for criminal persecution. And this is a zero tolerance policy, and Jeff Sessions is on the record saying that this is a deterrence policy, that separating children from their parents is made to de-incentivize people from coming here to this country illegally. But according to UN international law, if you are seeking asylum, you have a right, even if you don't have a visa, to come to the United States. You have, under international law, the right to present yourself to a court and declare your asylum, declare that you're being persecuted and that you have a founded fear for your life, and that refoulement, sending a country, the United States, sending somebody back to Guatemala would potentially or likely lead to that person's death. And so this was a very, very controversial in the United States. Many people protested this. There's some estimated 70,000 children in custody, infants, toddlers, and the UN has even gone as far to say that this is an act of torture for these children that is creating sort of irreparable mental and emotional damage. And the argument that's often made is that while these people should come here legally, but if they're refugees, they are coming here legally. What's illegal is to deny them the opportunity to seek asylum. The executive order that President Trump signed in June 20th of that year intended to bring that to a halt, although in practice this is still happening. And there has been no policy put in place to formally reunite these people with their children. And there's lots of concerns about these kids getting lost in foster care in the United States. It's just a real horrible tragedy. So I went to the border in November, and what I saw was not a reflection of the zero tolerance policy, but another policy that many of you may not be familiar with, that is what's directly creating these refugee camps. So has anybody heard of the Remain in Mexico program, or the MPP program?
Yes. These are where all of the camps are being set up, and you're waiting, and these migrants are basically waiting to like be able to cross the border. Like I was talking about earlier in Matamoros, there are people that are just camping out underneath the bridge that leads into the United States, and it's women and children, and they're basically waiting or living in these tents for like 8 months or even longer.
Yeah, up to 2 years. And so in the past, what has happened and what should happen is that when people declare asylum in the United States, they're given a court date, and oftentimes they're released to homeless shelters or to Catholic charity services. It's most oftentimes nonprofit organizations that provide shelter to these people while they await their day in court to plead their case. Under sort of zero tolerance, these folks were separated from their families and put in detention centers, right, which is what's happening. But now with the MPP program, rather than even just them being detained in the United States, these folks are, if you're from Central America, if you're not from Mexico, if you're from Central America, you are not allowed to stay in the United States while you await your day in court. And so they're essentially sent back to Mexico, walk across the border, and forced to stay in Mexico until they can get their day in court. And this is the Remain in Mexico program. But it's ironically called the Migrant Protection Protocol. But rather than protecting migrants, and by the way, they're not migrants, they're refugees, most of these people, folks who are simply looking for a higher wage are not going to live homeless in a tent in a camp with 8,000 people for a year. They literally have no place to go. They're returned to the Mexican border towns. There are some 60,000 people living in these MPP refugee camps, as Alex was saying, in Juarez, Matamoros, Mexicali, Nuevo Laredo, Piedras Negras, Tijuana, and Nogales. And I visited one of these camps along the border and took this picture touring the border infrastructure that's being built in Brownsville. It's really something fascinating. We are watching history unfold. I took a group of students and we walked into this camp. This is the Matamoros camp, and it was one of the most moving experiences that I've had recently. And ironically, horrifying, 2,000 people at this time were living in this camp. The number's even bigger. The conditions are horrific. This is a so-called store. This is the camp store where 2,000 people are getting medical supplies, diapers, basic hygiene. This 2,000 people using, these are the 3 showers that they have. The Mexican government is not providing refugee services. The US government is not there. The UN is not there. There have been some improvements in these camps, particularly this camp, coming from private donations. But the situation is dire, and it's all families. And we walked these camps, and it was just heartbreaking. It broke my heart. And this is an image coming back from Mexico across the bridge. You walk across the bridge, and if you happen to have been born on this side of the river than the other, you get a passport, and you need 4 quarters. And as a US citizen, you put your 4 quarters in the turnstile, you go into Mexico, and then it literally costs 35 cents. And having a US passport allows one to put a quarter and a dime in the turnstile coming back from Mexico and have the ability to escape the hell that these people are living in, all because of the accident of birth, all because of the politics of mobility. And these are the tents that have been constructed on the US side of the border. That's the Rio Grande, where people are waiting out 1.5 years, 2 years to get their day in court, oftentimes just to be told that they need to get a lawyer and get more papers together. It's just absolutely horrific. This is a hero. His name is Sergio Cordoba. He started a nonprofit organization called Teams Brownsville. They are providing 3 meals a day for these 2,000 refugees who are living there. And this is on the US side of the border. He's the one, and this is a student, a grad student here in our department, Chris. We were stopping and taking a picture, not of the 2 of them, but of all the barbed wire that's just there in the case that Border Patrol needs to or wants to seal off the bridge, the walking bridge, should that group of 2,000 people try to force their way into the United States. And what you can't see in these pictures, because I didn't dare take the picture, is that right about here, which is the top of the border, between the top of the bridge between Mexico and the United States, Border Patrol has a customs agent posted there that checks passports before you even get to the passport, you get to the immigration center. And that's like an informal checkpoint that Amnesty International and the ACLU says should not be there. And that is what I hear, what Sergio tells me is happening, is that they're actually turning away Mexican nationals too, who don't have permission to come to the United States, who don't have visa, because the Stay in Mexico protocol only applies to non-Mexicans, because the idea is that if these people are truly refugees, they're fleeing Honduras and Mexico, they should, or Honduras and Guatemala, they should be able to stay in Mexico while they wait for their day in court. Any comments or questions about the MPP camps?
When's the next time you're going to go down?
So I'm teaching a qualitative methods graduate seminar, and I think we're going to do sort of some research and intellectual sort of policy-based research. We're going to take a field trip this fall. And if you stay in touch, and if we can get you on that trip, I would really think that you would benefit from it. It's, you know, but what I want to say is that ironically, what's so interesting is that as horrible as it is to see the impacts of this unjust, inhumane policy, you know, I was so inspired by these people who are just ordinary people like you or I, who are literally making a difference and keeping these 2,000 people alive and doing this all across the southern border. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for volunteering and learning, and stay in touch with me in the fall if you're interested in going. Of course, COVID has made things even worse. The United States now is turning away everyone who's coming into the country, declaring asylum. There's just been a wall put around the entire United States, as you're aware. And the COVID outbreak in these camps is unfolding. It's just a matter of time. There's not adequate living, health, any sort of basic sanitary conditions for these people. And the Trump administration is expelling these border migrants and basically sending anybody who is still in Border Patrol custody back to Mexico. The camps are just going to explode, both in terms of their growth and in terms of the virus with these already vulnerable people. I mean, there's 2,000 people and there's like 4 latrines. You do the math. How is this going to work? I mean, it was just the most horrible, horrible situation to see people in. So having that said, I'm not exactly sure what COVID is going to bring in terms of my plans to go back and do some of this work. I think that we're at a unique, here's another picture of the camps. I mean, it's just unbelievable. This is like the worst refugee camp. This is the worse than the conditions that the Syrian refugees are living in Lebanon and Jordan. And I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like being here on the southern border that I have a unique position geographically and also with my job to sort of document this history and try to make sure, first and foremost, that history is being captured. I think this is a moment that people will look back on like we think about the Japanese internment during World War II. And it feels, I feel compelled to document this moment. And so that's where I'm kind of headed with my research. But I think today's class, sort of wraps up and it draws together a lot of the themes of this course, thinking about spaces and history being interconnected, and also thinking critically about the role of the United States and geopolitics around the world. And so let me just leave it there and see if you have any more questions or comments before I wrap up for today.
That article made me kind of sad that Beto O'Rourke wasn't running anymore. That's
Yeah.
Biden is.
He definitely has a unique perspective on the border. Yeah, but I also feel like a lot of people are unaware of what's happening with these camps. And there's certainly, going back to this idea of discourse, all of the way of talking about and representing a phenomenon. There's a discourse of migration from Central America that criminalizes these people, that paints them in negative ways as threats to U.S. society, rather than asylum seekers who should be protected under the 51 Convention, right? So this is going to be a big challenge. Us as geographers, people are going to continue to move. We have to continue to think about international law, international policy. And I always love when, students say that the course sort of gets them thinking about how they might apply their own granito they're in a, and that might include going to work for border patrol or working in the law, in the legal profession. And so I encourage you all to think about how this might shape your conversations and how we might do better by some of these communities that are really the most vulnerable. Are there any comments or questions? Any additional comments or questions? Okay, folks, so what's happening now is that I'm going to ask you to post some review IDs, some identification terms, as well as a review question to the forum space. And I'll send an email about that tomorrow. If you could complete that by Sunday, that would be great. On Monday, next Monday, we're going to have our last class. We're going to do a live session, and we're going to go over all of the terms and the questions to get you ready for the final exam, which is on May 13th. All right. I really appreciate you all that you're able to come and do this lecture alongside me. I really appreciate it. It's nice having an audience. I've certainly missed having you in class, but I'm wishing you all well. And if there's anything that I can do to make you finishing this course a little bit easier or feasible, more importantly, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm wishing you all well. Take care, and I hope to see you on Monday.